practice what you preach. A phrase that both reprimands, corrects, and encourages. A phrase that reminds us of authenticity, sincerity, and integrity. Let our actions be true reflections of the words that we say. You know, the phrase goes all the way back to the times before Jesus, to the plays of Titus Maccius Plautus, a Roman playwright who lived between 254 and 184 BC. And so these words, practice what you preach, were, I'm sure, the citizens of Palestine would have heard, maybe even repeated by the time that Jesus was born. Words whose meaning would have been clear to those who were listening to Jesus teach. Words that would have been a perfect way to illustrate the way the Pharisees and the religious leaders of the time were living. Words that give us timely guidance in how we ought to be living our lives today. In Matthew chapter 23, Jesus confronts the religious leaders and the Pharisees, and he calls out their hypocrisy, highlighting the difference between the way they told people to live and the way that they actually lived their lives. Jesus was drawing attention to the external religion of the teachers of the law and their lack of internal transformation that happened in their private spiritual lives. So let's read what Jesus said. Verse 1, Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. So you must obey them and do everything they tell you to do. But do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. They tie up heavy loads and put them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. Everything they do is done for men to see. They make their phylacteries wide and their tassels on their garments long. They love the place of honor at banquets and the most important seats in the synagogues. They love to be greeted in the marketplaces and to have men call them rabbi. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have only one master, and you are all brothers. And do not call anyone on earth Father, for you have one Father, and he is in heaven. Nor are you to be called teacher, for you have one teacher, the Christ. The greatest among you will be your servant, but for whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. This morning, let's take a few moments today and see what it means to practice what we preach. Not to live as true followers of Jesus, not just in word, but in action, and attitude, and deed. You see, in Matthew 23, Jesus contrasted the way that the Pharisees, the way of the Pharisees with the way of the kingdom as a way of reminding us that, well, quite frankly, we ought to practice what we preach. Our words and our actions should be the same thing. So let's look at three key differences between the Pharisees and what God is calling us to live. First, we're to practice grace over legalism. You know, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law had a problem. As the ones who were supposed to speak for God, interpret his words, and share his message with the people, they suffered from what we might call today the rules for thee, not for me disease. Ever heard that? Yeah, we've heard that before. They were the experts at piling on rules, adding one regulation to another, until following God felt like a crushing load. And that's exactly what Jesus was talking about in verse 4, Matthew 23. They tie up heavy loads and put them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. The heavy burden of the law was overwhelming. There were 613 commands that they had come up with. 248 telling you what you must do, and 365 telling you what you must not do. One for each day of the year. Hmm. Now, imagine trying to memorize and live by all of those rules. That's a lot of rules to live by. It'd be like trying to follow every single tax code that there is in existence without a guide or any grace if we made a mistake. It's awful. But, friends, that's what religion had become: endless rules with no relief in sight. You know, the Jews today still try to adhere to all of these rules. Consider what's happened in the city, in the borough of Manhattan in New York City. You know, it's hard to imagine that anything literally hanging from utility poles across Manhattan could be considered hidden. But throughout the borough, approximately 18 miles of translucent wire stretches around the skyline. And most people have never likely noticed. It's called an Eruv, and its existence is thanks to the Jewish Sabbath. You see, on the Sabbath, which is viewed as a day of rest, the Jews aren't allowed to carry anything, books or groceries or even children, outside of their home. If you do so, it's considered work, and you're not supposed to work on the Sabbath, right? You're supposed to rest. And so the Eruv encircles much of Manhattan, acting like a symbolic boundary that turns the very public streets of the city into a private space, much like one's own home. And so it was stretching the boundaries of your home. This allows people to freely communicate and socialize on the Sabbath and carry whatever they please outside of the doors of their home without having to worry about breaking Jewish law. Found a way around it, huh? The writer Sharon Cohen explains that the Eruv, these were created by the sages of the Talmud to get around the traditional prohibitions on carrying house keys, prayer books, canes, or walkers, or even children who cannot walk on their own. Now we think, okay, that's New York City. Well, of course, they're doing that in New York City, right? But you know, it's not the only metropolis in the United States with such boundaries. These also exist in St. Louis, Atlanta, Baltimore, Chicago, Dallas, and numerous other cities across the country. Now, a cynic might wonder at the effort required to string wire around huge areas of a public space in order to allow adherents of a religion to do what the tenets of that religion would otherwise prohibit. Some religious-minded people might even find it hard to imagine that God wouldn't regard this as a flagrant concoction of a city-sized loophole. Kind of crazy, isn't it? But if you've got to come up with things like that in order to get around the rules, because the rules are too hard, then what's the point? And it's into that very world that Jesus came. I think he understood this. Into this exhausting, rule-heavy system, Jesus stepped with an entirely different message. One that lifts burdens instead of adding them. Over in Matthew chapter 11, Jesus said this. He said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your soul. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." I'm glad you studied that this morning in Sunday school, apparently. You see, the word yoke has a double meaning. Yes, it's the wooden harness that is used to connect two oxen together so they can pull a load together. And so in that sense, Jesus might be saying, get into the harness with me, and I'll help you carry life's load. But yoke was also a first century term for a rabbi's main teaching. And so when Jesus says his yoke is easy, he's telling us that his teaching will not weigh us down like the Pharisees' rules. And then Jesus does something else. He goes and he simplifies the entire law, all 613 commands, into two life-changing instructions. Over in Matthew 22, Jesus said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. All of the law and the prophets hang on these two commands. You see, Jesus didn't lower the standard. He revealed the heart behind it. Loving God, loving people. Now, folks, those things still take a lot of work, don't they? It isn't easy. It takes sacrifice. But instead of being full of rules, it's fueled by grace instead of being drained by legalism. Folks, we live under grace. And when we do, it changes us. It changes the way we treat others. It changes our approach to God. We stop adding to the load of our neighbors, and we start helping them to lift it. Well, second, this morning, we're to practice authenticity over performance. The disingenuousness of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law was on full display for everyone to see, wasn't it? Jesus said it plainly in verse 5 of Matthew 23, everything they do is done for men to see. It was a big show. It was a big production. It was nothing more than performance art, trying to draw their attention. And honestly, you know what? We live in a world today that is just like that. Everything is for people's attention. We have politicians that scramble, for example, for the cameras. They stage big grandiose moments, and they deliver big fancy speeches full of sound and fury, yet they don't do a single thing to support the people that they're supposed to represent. It's all for production. It's all for the show. And the Pharisees were the same way. They wanted everyone to see what they were doing because deep down, what they were doing wasn't genuine at all. You know, Jesus warned us about this kind of behavior in the Sermon on the Mount over in Matthew 6. And he told us three things. He said, you need to, when you give to the needy, don't announce it with trumpets. Don't do that. Don't make a big production. Just give quietly without drawing attention to what you're doing. And then he said, when you pray, don't turn it into a big public performance. That's not what you're here for. Find a quiet, private place and speak to your Father in secret. And then fasting. When you fast, he said, don't wear a gloomy face so that the entire world knows what you're doing. No. Go about your day. Look normal. Do your normal things. Carry on with your day and let it be something between you and your God. Jesus says when we make a show of things, we've already received our reward. And that reward is the applause and the approval of men. And folks, that's all we're going to get if that's what we're doing it for. But instead, our service and our devotion should be for God's glory, for His applause, not man's. Jesus, you see, calls us to live for an audience of one. God. He sees our heart. He knows our true intentions. You know, there's a story that comes from England about an actor performing in a theater one time. A famous actor. And, word got out and spread that the king was going to be in attendance that night at the performance. And so, everybody was on edge. Everybody, was excited and, just couldn't wait. And they rehearsed extra hard. They polished every detail and they prepared to give the performance of their lifetime. But just before the curtain rose, news came that, the king's plans had changed. And guess what? He wasn't going to be there. They had done all of this for nothing. They had done all of this extra effort and no one was going to see it. Or so they said. But that night the lead actor, he went ahead and he delivered one of the finest performances of his career. And afterwards, a reporter asked him, how could you give such an incredible performance when the king wasn't even here to see it? And the actor smiled and he said, you don't understand. Every performance is for the king. That's the mindset Jesus is calling us to have. It doesn't matter whether anybody notices or not. And it makes no difference if we get a thank you or not. Every act of service, every act of prayer, every gift we give, folks, it's for the King. It is not for you. It is not for me. It is not for anybody else. And when it is for Him, that's when it becomes authentic and real and not just a performance. Finally, this morning, we got to practice humility over pride. When I think about this, I think about titles. Titles we give ourselves. The Pharisees and the teachers of the law, they were all about those titles, weren't they? You see, titles signify social status. They tell people where you are in the pecking order. They announce your importance before you even open your mouth. In the first century, titles were there like rabbi, teacher, father. And these titles carried weight. They meant you had authority, respect, and influence. The Pharisees loved being called by those titles in the marketplaces. They loved to be called out with those titles at banquets for everyone to hear. And they loved to have people use those titles when addressing them in the synagogues and in the temple. It was a public badge of honor, you see. It's not unique to Israel, is it? We have titles today in our world. Doctor, professor, CEO, manager, director, vice president, president, officer, all words that we use in the business world. And of course, the unwritten titles that come along with status as well. Big donor, influencer, board member. Titles. They do exactly what they're intended to do. In what I'm most familiar with, financial institutions, for example, when I know someone's got the title of vice president or an officer or something like that, I act a little differently. I behave a little bit more than what I do if I'm just around somebody that's called teller. Titles often give us and guide our attitudes and our actions, don't they? Now, folks, there is nothing wrong with the title in and of itself. The problem comes when the title becomes the goal. When the position or the recognition matters more than the service that it's supposed to represent. And see, that's where the Pharisees lived. Right there. They didn't want to just serve God's people. They wanted to do it and to be seen as important while they were serving God's people. Jesus, on the other hand, flips that entire system upside down, doesn't he? In verses 11 and 12, he said this. He said, the greatest among you will be your servant. For whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. You see, in the kingdom of God, greatness is not measured by how many people serve you. It's measured by how many people you serve. The Apostle Paul gives us the ultimate example in Philippians chapter 2. And he starts and he writes there in verse 5, he says, your attitude should be the same as that of Jesus Christ. And then he quotes what is often considered an early hymn sung by the early Christians. And it goes like this. It says, who being in the very nature of God did not consider equality with God something to be grasped. But he made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself. And he became obedient to death, even death on a cross. Therefore God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, and that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and that every tongue confess that Jesus is Lord. Why? To the glory of God the Father. Think about it. Jesus had the highest position in the universe. He had the ultimate title. The eternal Son of God. None of us can ever get that title. And yet he didn't cling to it. He put it down in order that he might become a servant, to wash feet, to touch the lepers, to welcome children, to go to the cross for our salvation. You know, Adam and Eve tried to reach for something that wasn't theirs to take. They wanted to be like God. They wanted that title. Didn't work out so well, did it? You see, Jesus, though, was already God. Yet he let go of that privilege to humble himself for our sake. And because of that humility, God exalted him, lifted him up. He seated it at God's right hand. You see, if we're going to follow Jesus, we cannot cling to our titles, our status, or our pride. True greatness in the kingdom comes through humility. So the question today is for us is this: who can we serve this week? Where can we step out of the spotlight so that someone else can be lifted up? Whose burden can we help carry? If we live for recognition, that's going to be our reward. But if we humble ourselves before God, we will find that the reward is far greater. Where we find joy. Joy that comes from serving our King. This morning, we need to practice what we preach. It's more than just a catchy little catchphrase. It's a call to live a life that is genuine, authentic, consistent with what we claim to believe. Pharisees had religion, folks. Boy, were they full of religion. But they did not have a transformation. They had the right words, but the wrong heart. Jesus calls us to something better. A life marked with grace instead of legalism. Authenticity instead of performance. And humility instead of pride. Grace means we lift burdens instead of adding to them. Authenticity means we serve for God's eyes, not for man's applause. Humility means we lay down our statuses in order to lift others up. When we live this way, our faith is not just something we kind of talk about and chat about on Sunday mornings. No. It becomes the very fabric of our being, of our lives, of who we are. Our words and our actions begin to line up. They match. Our public witness matches our private devotion. And folks, that's when people can see that what we have is real, is genuine, is the true thing. And folks, that's what our world needs to see today. A genuineness in the lives of people who follow God. The world doesn't need any more religious performances. We don't need that. It doesn't need any more empty titles. What it needs is to see is the followers of Jesus who genuinely live out their lives based on the words that they proclaim, which should be the Word of God. We might need to take a moment and examine our lives. We might need to think a little bit about our actions, the words we speak, the tone with which we use. Folks, we need to live this week in our homes, in our jobs, in our neighborhoods. We need to live for an audience of one. He's the only one that matters. Let your life be shaped by grace, authenticity, and humility, so that when people look at us and they look at our lives and they look at who we are, they don't see me. They see Jesus. I pray today that we're a people who don't just preach the truth, that we live it. May we be a church whose faith is real, genuine, whose service is sincere, and whose love is unmistakable. Because, folks, when our lives match our message, when we truly practice what we preach, then, folks, the world is going to take notice. And they're going to ask what's different about our lives. We have the opportunity to share the gospel of Jesus Christ with them. And not for our glory, not for our praise, but for the glory of God our Father.